So we're going to share with you today and a little bit of background. The Metris Institute is our not-for-profit arm of Metris that teams up with people like American Society for Quality, Conference Board, and others over the years to identify trends that are taking place. Human capital studies, we do a lot of executive thought leader breakfasts that all provide insight. And that's really separate from our for-profit arm that does surveys and consulting to a wide variety of organizations. So some of the things I'm going to share with you today are things we've learned from some of that benchmarking and some of the work with those organizations. The story that we're going to talk about, though, goes back a long way, and analytics are not new. I don't know how many people recognize the picture here, but this is Henry Ford. And Henry Ford knew a century ago that, you know, if he could keep the assembly line running and use good operational metrics, they would have a certain amount of throughput that would yield calculable levels of revenue and profitability. So metrics were being used then, and I'm sure they were probably being used even in among cave people years ago who probably were getting surveys by someone. People like Elton Mayo back in the early 1900s were experimenting with the Western Electric Hawthorne plant, and their team altered working conditions and monitored the impact on worker morale and productivity. So they looked at things like changing work hours, rest breaks, lighting, humidity, temperature, and found that those had an impact on worker, productivity. Somewhat later than that, not very long, we heard a lot about Frederick Winslow Taylor, who came in and really coined scientific management as a principle. And while a lot of people look at Taylorism as being archaic, much more authoritarian, very few people remember that Taylor was one of the primary people to introduce rest breaks to both physical jobs as well as mental jobs, with the notion that if I introduce these breaks, people are going to be more productive in the work that they do. And the thing that he was really noted for was reducing variance. So how do we begin to learn why we have a lot of variability? Mark's going to talk later about the implications of that for restaurants. You don't want to have people go in one case they feel like they're at a Jack in the Box, and the next case they feel like they're at a competitor, because the people that are delivering are producing something very different from place to place. So this was sort of the early movement. Most recently, I had the wonderful opportunity here to work with Dave Allrich and Libby Sartain and a whole host of great HR thought leaders and looking at what are the challenges faced by HR today. The question we went out and asked these 73 global thought leaders, and these are folks, show you some of the names that were from, corporations, some of them from leading academic institutions, leading associations around the globe, and leading consultants. And what we asked them is the question that we just posed on this prior page, which is, what do HR professionals need to know or do to be effective today in tomorrow's business world, right? And, of course, one worry we had was everybody would come back with the same answer, but it was very robust. There were a lot of different viewpoints that came out of that, and it really led to 7 key theme areas here. Context to strategy, what's the environment in which we're managing people, looking at digital issues, globalization. What about the outcomes of the organization? And these would include thinking about the way we actually structure organizations, boundaryless being an issue today. How do we deal with changing economies like gig economy? Talent supply, ensuring that in a world in which we have increasing problems with STEM skills and other difficult to find competencies, what can organizations do to manage that more effectively? And talent optimization. We put a lot of money into people, into the hiring of people, the development of people. And the question is, at the end of the day, if you're the CFO or the CEO, is, so are we getting the maximum return we could from these individuals that we've hired, the talent, this wonderful set of knowledge and skills and experiences and behaviors that are in our organization? But I could also flip the question around. Part of the new book I'm working on that's coming out this summer called Life Fulfilled is about the individual side. How do you find fulfillment? What role does career play? And we could say the same thing. How does my experience of working with this organization optimize my life and my career plans? And we all know, who work in organizations, we've seen that when there's a great pop between the individual and the organization, and things really flourish. So the analytical part here, I think, is theme 5 that came out of this is, how do we understand this better? How do we get the insights that connect things that people are doing with business outcomes? How do we tap into what drives engagement? How do we tap into the alignment of people in the organization? And those are critical elements today to give us an ability to really predict the future and to manage it better. And then there were themes here around HR governance and HR professionalism, which I'm not going to cover in this session. But if you're interested in this book that was sponsored by HR Certification Institute, we thank them greatly for that. There's a free download available. It's an e-book. So if you want to buy a hard copy, you can do that. But the book is free, and all you have to do is go to the Rise of HR site for that. What was interesting for me, and at the time I was on the Sherman Foundation board, there was a study done that Peter Capelli was kind enough to host at Wharton on what are the challenges today in 2011 that we have in the analytics area. And you can see some of the things on the chart here. A sense that we spent too much time in the area of benchmarking, over-reliance on it. And I know we have some listeners, or we at least had some planned listeners from Walmart. And if you think about comparing Walmart to Nordstrom's, right, or to Zappos, they really have very different business models. And what was discussed at this session was that we often go out and try to benchmark across organizations, say, well, these are all retail, but are they really? They have very, very different ways that they drive value to their customers, very different ways of making a difference in the market. And we need to think about that much more specifically to our strategy than we do with across-the-board generalizations. Another big one here was the lack of predictive models. And the fact that people weren't making a lot of good decisions with the analytics that were available. A lot of deer-in-the-headlight types of behaviors. And if I compare that to this new study we just did 5 years later, sponsored by HRCI, you're going to see some common things here. Do we really understand the business value proposition that we're doing the metrics or trying to learn about the organization using metrics? Are we asking the right questions? Are we looking around the corner in the front? Are we looking through the rearview mirror much as we would with financial metrics? And are there practical implications for what we're finding? And the implications of this, let me just move this forward. I want to dig into a couple of areas. One, so many of the writers that we've looked at who are doing a good job in this space and those who have studied it have come back to say you've got to start with the right questions. That too often we're out on a fishing trip trying to drag a big net and hoping to come up with something, when the reality is we've got to start with questions that make sense to the business, make sense to executives. A lot of conversation around big data. And the question is, so many people are becoming overwhelmed with data in the organization. Today, data is ubiquitous. When I started my career, it was hard and expensive to find information that you wanted. Today, it's there, but we have a signal-to-noise problem. And all of you turned in a radio station or something where you can't get, you get a lot of fuzziness and very little signal of whether it's music or news, realize what that's like. And the reality is today we've got tons of this information coming in, and it's just a lot of noise for managers. How do we narrow that down? And Mark's going to talk a little bit about what they've done at Jack in the Box to do that. It's stereotyping is a big issue today, and I'm going to throw out the biggest word today that's happening in stereotyping is millennials. We go out and say millennials as if they are all the same, as if they have all the same desires, the same values, the same goals. And much as we would anybody who's an X or a baby boomer today would say, well, there's a lot of people in my age cohort who have very different needs and objectives and goals. And so one of the things data can help us do is understand some of the richness of this diversity and take advantage of that. The other one is model-driven, and I think a lot of the folks that we studied came back and said, let's use good models. Let's work on models, let's prove that they work, and then let's begin to adapt them to our organization. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a moment. And then I'll just kind of close here, since we've talked about the hindsight, foresight issue already, more with the importance of growing value. So organizations today are at every level, whether you're a company, whether you're a function, whether you're a team or an individual, people want to know what value you're delivering and how that's growing from period over period. So the other thing, metrics are really helpful for us if we have the right ones. I know Mark's a runner. I used to be a runner. And, you know, you look at your times. You look at, you know, critical metrics that are important to you to advance and get a little better each period going forward. And yet one of the problems we have in organizations is that metrics are often a frightening term. When I do workshops in organization and I ask people about the word measurement, about 7 out of every 10 comments come back with something negative. People have been beat down by metrics, or metrics have been used to somehow demotivate them. So I think it's one of the challenges we have today in organizations. One point I want to drill down a little bit on is, and I think everyone can do a far better job, back to the signal to noise ratio. We've got a lot of stuff that falls into this efficiency and activity at the bottom of the triangle that you see up here. If you think about something like a number of requisitions filled, we can get better, and you always hear managers saying, I want you to hire somebody faster, what's your time to fill? But the reality is it's a nice efficiency measure, but it's not very effective in the sense that if we get talent in the door but it doesn't stay, then we've spent a lot of money to meet a metric that doesn't have as much impact on the organization. Even worse, and probably those of you who have had experience at a hotel or rented a car with some employee who's been a semi-terrorist to you, that you can find people, you can keep them, but frankly, if they terrorize your customers or your guests, it's not a very good impact for the organization. So I think the move in the last few years has been to move toward the impact measures, and those are the ones that are really more strategic for the business. Those are the ones that for a Walmart or Nordstrom's or Zappos would be some very different things because their business strategies are different and need to capitalize on those. So I want to share with you one of the models that we've been working with for the last 10 years or so called people equity. And it's a model we developed over 10 years of not only our own work at the Metris Institute, but also reviewing hundreds of articles in the literature around the topics that drive business performance. And we found 3 mega factors that really seem to drive and connect people and people performance with business outcomes, business results. And one, of course, is engagement that we hear every day. Of course, you know, back in the 90s, there were a lot of folks saying, let's start thinking about engagement. It was hard to get leaders' attention. And engagement, as we use it and think about it, it's not only the satisfiers that were out here being studied by Elton Mayo and by Taylor and folks, but moving up to levels of commitment, mutual commitment, and at the highest level, advocacy. People are willing to stand up, raise their hand, and in a public way support the organization. The area of capabilities is an interesting one because we crafted this from a lot of the review of the literature around what does the customer need. When the customer, if you go in to rent a car and you show up, you really don't care how the person was trained, you don't care about the IT system that took your order, and you don't care about the logistics manager who had to get the right cars in the right place. It all comes together at this great moment of truth for you. But on the inside of the organization, there's a huge coordinating activity that goes on between competencies and information and resources. And when that comes together, we get delighted customers. And then the third area is alignment. We could be working really hard, we could have passion, we can be excited, but if we're working on the wrong things that aren't really adding value to the business, then we don't succeed. Or if two departments are working at cross purposes and not synchronized in the way they're rowing the boat forward, then we have problems. So this is vertical alignment. How clear are the goals? To what extent are we living the brand promise? Are we aligned with our customers? And the whole performance management area of goal setting, feedback, ties very closely into this area. When all three of these areas are clicking, that's when we're finding we're not only just getting good people results, we're getting good business results. And one of the things we were frequently asked by CFOs and CEOs is, so what's the impact? And we took the ACE model, the ACE framework out, and looked at that in over 2,000 organizations. What we found is that when you had high people equity, high alignment capabilities engagement, you were twice as likely to be a financial leader in the industry, 3 times more likely to be a quality leader, and you had about 1/2 the turnover as low people equity organizations. And we went on to look at customers, we went on to look at customer complaints, we went on to look at quality, other quality metrics, and the relationships hold. Even internally, if we think about the importance today of HR or finance or security, demonstrating value to the organization, because let's face it, we've seen a huge amount of outsourcing in the last 10 years. What happens is services that are of less value than can be delivered outside are often outsourced. And the important thing to think about is, where are you when you have low engagement overall? If you look at the yellow bars on this chart, what you'll see is the functions like HR are typically getting ratings around 20% favorable when we go to their customers. And these are customers who are knowledgeable. We ask customers only customers or stakeholders who felt that the function was one of their top 3 functions. So to get a rating here in HR, it had to be rated by somebody who felt HR was one of the top 3 functions they depend on to deliver their work. And you're getting ratings around 20% for HR, 20% for marketing, around a little over 20% for sales. If you can grow engagement and have high engagement, you get to the orange bars. And there you see HR going up from around 20 to almost 40% favorable. But if you could get all 3 areas, alignment, capabilities, and engagement, high in the organization, go look at the HR scores here, skyrocketed up to near 80% favorable among their stakeholders, up to almost 90% in groups like customer service. So we've had these benchmarks we've been tracking since '93, and if you create that high alignment capabilities and engagement, that's where the real value is being produced. So it gives you a little sense of the model, but how does it play out in practice? And what you're going to see, and Mark's going to share a little bit about what it looks like in their organization. If you take this sample organization we have here, it's a company that has units in the East, Central, and West. They have units underneath those. And if you think about the scores, by the way, these are all obtained through an employee survey that not only measures engagement, but it also can measure alignment, can measure capabilities. And I could spend a long time telling you how that got developed, but it originally started as fairly clunky, cumbersome audits, and eventually moved to much more streamlined ways to get this information through the eyes of employees. And if you look at the scores on this page, they're color-coded. So the red scores are really the unfavorable scores. The green are the favorable ones, and yellow kind of in the intermediate range. And if you look at this picture, You can put your Sherlock Holmes hats on for those of you who are deer stalkers, right? You can see a couple of different things that jump out at you, and this is what the CEOs love. This is what the line leaders love. Is right away I can see that overall in my organization, I've got something really happening that's going on pretty well in the West. What's West doing? They've got some best practices, and too often we don't really go out and find out what it is that they're doing that's so great. And people are here with really high engagement scores, for example. If you look to Central, kind of the reverse. We've got a lot of problems. We've got a lot of low scores in all the areas with a couple of exceptions. And so one is individual variance. Every one of these boxes is run by a manager. How can we go help those managers, as Gary Ridge, the CEO of WD-40 would say, how do we help them get an A? How do we help them succeed? Because every one of them has an investment of talent working for them in these units. And not all of them are triple green, which would mean we're really optimizing the talent. Second theme you'd see is that overall the organization has more problems with alignment. It's the weakest area for the company. And even in the West, if I had to pick one area for West to work on, it would be alignment, which is lower than the other two areas. So it helps us think about some systemic things we might do as a company in bringing and helping all the boats to rise. It helps us target individual managers for coaching, development, training as well. And then you see some anomalies like the Unit 3 here under Central, where you have a 76% green rating and engagement, and yet dismal ratings in the other two areas. And it says, let's go in and investigate. Let's find out what's happening in this unit. And what you find in this unit is even though engagement's high, as is Unit 3 under the West, you have very, very different customer scores, very low declining customer scores. We have people who've been prevented from going to training, capability scores are down, and people are very aligned with the manager but not with the organization. So it also helps us begin to figure out where can we go to understand what's going on in the organization. How do we get beneath the surface numbers and look? And if we think about the 8 profiles that you're likely to see, you're going to see scores like the ones on this chart, which could be triple green, which is the only optimized one. But you're going to see scores, for example, like strategic disconnect, where capabilities are high, engagement's high, but people aren't necessarily working on all the right things. And so we're frustrating them because they're working hard, perhaps, and not getting the same outcomes. Or they're under-equipped. They have low capabilities and need some development training or new skills in the group. The remaining profile you have here would be disengaged or unable, unwilling, wasted talent, or high risk, the triple red. Each one of these requires looking beneath the surface and saying, how can we help that unit get rid of the red scores and move up to a more optimized profile? So it really allows you to begin thinking about customizing, as opposed to HR's biggest critique in recent years of one size fits all. How do we help HR actually customize things that it is doing differentially and using its resources wisely to help managers in different units succeed? So with that background, and Mark's going to talk a little bit about, because he's used this ACE framework, and so that's why we combined these today to talk about that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Okay, well, thanks, Bill. And I think that, you know, what you had to say paints a pretty good background for what I'm going to dive into in terms of a little bit of the detail. So, you know, we always start with kind of our organizational framework, and Bill spoke to, you know, you start with your strategy, and that helps you then kind of understand what are the rest of the questions you need to ask. What is your, you know, how does your employee value proposition connect to your customer value proposition, and therefore, you know, what analytics makes sense for you? And so it can be dangerous when you go after benchmarking because you have different strategies. So you're going after different talent profiles, and so your expectations of the organization and your employees are varied. And when I came to Jack in the Box going on 19 years ago now, Jack in the Box was very much steeped into the service profit chain, which was made, very public by the work that came out of Sears. A lot of service-based organizations adopted kind of the service profit chain model, and then we certainly fell into that category. And at the time where we were falling short was integrating the data that we had then. So the company had a lot of operational measures. Like most of you, I'm sure you have a lot of business measures that you have, so we knew everything about our operations. We also happen to have a lot of people measures. Unfortunately, we never put the data together. So while we measured engagement and we measured a lot of employee things, and we measured a lot of financial and operational things, no one had ever really pieced the two together. So the service profit chain was more a belief system in the organization than it was truly a validated model. So some of our early analytics helped us fundamentally validate what we believed to be true, kind of in our hearts, as it were, from a leadership perspective. And we saw things that probably many of you and what you've read about from many other organizations. We saw nice relationships between things such as turnover and guest satisfaction. Similarly, we saw relationships between turnover and operational performance, or sales in this case. And we went as far as to do some fairly sophisticated modeling work like Sears. So we could say things like, if we could improve satisfaction with your supervisor by, a quarter of a point, for example, on our Likert scale, you would predict sales and profitability to go up by X%. And while that was meaningful and impactful and the organization was satisfied with that, it really wasn't very actionable from a leader's perspective. I mean, it made sense statistically, but it was a little actually, honestly too sophisticated for a line leader to do anything with. And so about 10 years ago, we ran into Bill at a conference, and we learned about the people equity scorecard work that was going on. And so we transitioned over from a measurement perspective and a model perspective to this. And so as you saw earlier, you create nice scorecards. And I think that the important point I really want to make here, and I think one of the most powerful aspects of the information, is that it's really critical in your business, as it is in ours, to drive the data down to the lowest level possible. So again, when we first started doing this work on our own, we only took our data down to what you see as the area box. So this is a district manager who is responsible in this case for several restaurants reporting to them. And so if you're this district manager, and I now hand to you the results of your ACE data in this case, and you see that your scores are kind of all in the yellow, not great, not bad. The challenge with that is you're going to look to your restaurants, because that's all the visibility you have, and you're going to treat all of those restaurants like they look like that profile. When in fact, as you can see, and these are real data, these aren't made up, there is a ton of variance. And so it's really critical where you have enough employees, whether in our business it's restaurants or in staff functions as well, that the data get driven down to the lowest level possible, because now that leader is better equipped to have conversations with those restaurant managers, to look at best practices, to create action plans that are very specific and very meaningful for each of those locations. The other aspect of this work is that, you realize in a business like ours, it is really critical to not sit back and feel good when you may be doing in some places but not other places. And oftentimes, you really have to look for those bright spots and bring them over. So, we have a franchise business as well. Today, we're 80% run by our franchise owners with our Jack in the Box brand, and about 50% with our Qdoba Mexican Eats brand. It's really important to realize, like, your guest doesn't care if they go to a restaurant that's franchised or a company. It's all your brand. And so you want your brand to be very consistent in the way that it executes. And the data, when you can drill down to the level of granularity that we're able to now, we're much better able to push consistency across execution, or at least understand where we're consistent and where we're not, and continue to work on it. And so as you push down through the results from looking at alignment, capabilities, and engagement, other things you get that we didn't necessarily get through our service profit chain framework is this level of understanding not only of the relationships between overall scores and outcomes. So for example, the ACE data can account for about half of the variability in turnover. You can see here that alignment, capabilities, and engagement do not contribute equally to that relationship. And as a matter of fact, as you drill down below the kind of dimension of alignment, capabilities, and engagement, and you get down to the item level that make up the dimensions, you can further refine the drivers of each of those things. So I can't necessarily focus the organization or a leader on every aspect of capabilities, but I can see here that if I can better focus them on access to training that employees need, I can have a much bigger impact. It doesn't mean the other things are unimportant, like teamwork and cooperation, but again, it's about the ability to allow you to focus your leaders on the most critical few, because one thing we know for sure today is we're all completely overwhelmed with information and data. So when you can really laser focus them in on the critical few, you can really move the ball on performance is what we're seeing. And so, you know, just to share with you the relationship in a similar way that we've seen with the service profit chain work now with the people equity-based information, restaurants that are high in ACE versus restaurants that are low in ACE, I will just say, first of all, they outperform them on any metric we measure. In fact, the top 20% of ACE restaurants outperform the bottom 80% on every financial and operational metric, and they have consistently for the past decade. So the data, while the absolute relationships may vary a little bit because of sampling, the order of magnitude has been incredibly consistent, which has been a powerful tool for HR to use when we go after things that can be improved. So those restaurants experience 21% lower turnover on average. Their productivity, this is a labor as a percentage of sales. So while 2.3% seems like a small number, that's 2.3% on an average unit volume of $1.5 million. And that's per copy. So now multiply that by 3,000 units. I think the CEO and the operations leaders and the CFO start to take a real interest in what you have to share with them from your HR chair. Other things we see, guest problems tend to be significantly lower, and the ability to resolve problems when they occur, which is a key driver of loyalty in our business, is their ability to resolve problems. I think people understand that you're not going to be perfect, but when you're not perfect and you don't fix it, that is a huge detractor, at least in our business. So those restaurants are able to resolve problems much better. On an average, they enjoy, obviously, higher feedback from the guests. And then, you know, the slide that really hits home to our franchise owners and our operational leaders is that at the end of the day, these restaurants significantly outperform their peers. And remember, these restaurants, you know, in theory, are all the same. It's the same box with the same menu, the same operating systems, the same policies and procedures. And so all of that intangible, what we used to consider that intangible variance, is due to the people, and it's primarily due to the leadership. So, you know, in coming full circle, I would take you back to kind of that STAR model I showed at the beginning. It's you have to make sure that your processes and your talent, you know, the type of talent you're looking for, and then the reward systems that you apply to those folks all align with your strategy. So you drive the right behaviors in the right way, and I think that in our case, you know, we've found that we yield significant positive outcomes. And, you know, I don't suspect that, you know, any of us believe that we're anywhere close to being able to measure everything that we can. and even some of the things that we can measure at the end of the day are less important than some of the things we can't. So it's still a work in progress. I think we continue to fine-tune the framework and the model as we learn more, and certainly Metris has demonstrated pretty good flexibility with us to continue to refine the process. But I think the most rewarding piece of it, again, is the consistency of the results over time versus, you know, a single sample that shows us something, and the fact that operations now completely buys into this process. So it's not me selling something to the business. They've seen this enough to know, to the point where, you know, leaders are held accountable to these outcomes. And if you're a leader in the organization, whether you're in an operations position or a staff position, and you are unable to drive consistent positive ACE outcomes, you have a very difficult time remaining in the system. So, you know, that's kind of like the next level of accountability. And you would think that at some point when you start to drive accountability to that level, that leaders would start to incent you know, undesirable behaviors from employees to give them positive marks. But I've found over time, I've been pleasantly surprised that employees really are quite honest about their experiences at work, primarily because they don't want to work for a bad leader. So they're not going to let a bribery of some type or coercion of some type drive the responses that they provide. I find them to be incredibly honest, even if the feedback they're giving is not necessarily always positive. So that said, I am going to turn it back over to Bill to take us home, at least with the formal part of our presentation.
Yeah, and then we'll take questions. So if you have some questions, please send them in to Raymond Lee, and we'll come back to those in a moment. Mark, I think, you know, your comments are right on. I mean, I think one of the things that that you guys have done so well is you've used information and analytics to narrow the focus and to use it to both point where should we focus, but also how should we focus. And I think, you know, it's one of the challenges today is you can be doing a lot of things, and we all have limited time, limited, you know, resources to do it. So I think this ability to sift and narrow down the many to the few can really help. But you need to go out and test those hypotheses. You know, are they working? So in the case of Jack in the Box, I mean, you know, we had hypotheses originally about, you know, what's driving turnover. And, you know, in this industry, you know, you have a huge cost when you've got 130% turnover. If you get it down to 90% turnover, you're way ahead of your competitors, and it's a huge impact on the bottom line. So again, it gets management's attention, but it also means that you focus on things we have to do, and those may change, by the way, over time. So, you know, if today training is a big gap for you and you need to close the gap on training, 2 years from now, it may be another issue that's really the thing you can begin improving, you know, next in turnover. I think the strategic versus tactical one is really important for HR leaders. If you want to be taken credibly by senior leaders, you've got to bring them things that will help them make decisions. One of the things we do a lot is help organizations build surveys, you know, and I think one of the people wrote in a question, how do we collect this data, or where do we get it from? And I hope to answer that a little bit earlier with the fact that we now do it through a survey, but it also means honing questions, things we did for Jack in the Box, for example, on alignment were different. While you have some core alignment questions, there are things that are related to their business. So when Jack in the Box went through a change of its priorities, one of the things senior management wants to know is how well do people really understand that? How well have those changes, you know, been integrated into the business or not? And Mark, I don't know if you want to comment at all on that, but I mean, I think that's one of those tools where you come back and say, alignment to us is really connected to our strategy, to our goals, to our key priorities, and we need to measure that in a way that's different than a generic question around, do you understand where the company's going, which, you know, people can say, but you can actually go out and really test for that.
Yeah, that's a part we didn't speak to, Bill, but in addition to kind of the core, you know, alignment capabilities and engagement items, you can obviously pepper in other activities that are going on in your organization, and you can look at the relationships between those initiatives and the ACE data. Another thing that I kind of passed over was, you know, to the degree that you have information about your workforce. So, for example, you know, you can parse the data by your demographics, for example, so by tenure and gender, ethnicity. You can look at high performers versus low performers, and you can see now a finer passing of the data. So, for example, one year we learned that when we looked at people who were relatively new to the organization, they felt like the culture was so strong it wasn't very inviting. It took a while for the culture to allow you to come into the organization. And so we were able to implement very quickly a process to strengthen our onboarding systems in the organization, which had a significant impact then. But not knowing that, not being able to slice the ACE data by those variables, you know, we found that high performers and high potential people, their response profiles were a little bit different, which leads you then potentially to very different interventions organizationally. Otherwise, you'll tend to, you know, you'll generalize at the level of the information that you have. I take you back to the slide where if you're a district manager with 8 restaurants, but I only show you your averaged scores, I can't individualize my intervention. It's the same thing when you think about your organization by all the variables that you capture, that you have in your human resource information system. So you really can get a multiplier effect on the power of the data coming from the survey process, which makes it much more strategic in nature.
Yep, and I think the other third element here is this issue of the future. We just came back, Dave Allrich and Libby, Sartain, and I just presented at the SIOP conference. And one of the big questions that comes up frequently is, that's great. How do you, is this going to help us predict something? Can we look at something that's going to happen and have an intervention today to help fix it or help improve it? Can you tell us about retention of people in critical jobs? Or can you take retention of people who are high potentials? And the information, if it's captured the right way and analyzed, can certainly do that. One of the things we also learned in the process the last few years is that exit data is highly suspect. We've had probably 50% of that exit data is just wrong. And what we're finding is that if you go out and look at both through surveys and through interviews, and we've even done focus groups, of people who have left the organizations between 3 to 12 months, you get far richer information about what the real reasons are for departure. You also get something you can't get at departure, which is, hey, is the grass really greener? And as Mark said, people are remarkably honest, I'm finding, in saying, you know, yeah, I left for this reason, I got A and B, but, you know, I really kind of miss C, and I miss something about the values of the culture. And what that provides, is leading us into in this conversation, is how do I build a great employer brand that really differentiates me from in the marketplace? Let's face it today, you know, it's tough when you're in retail, it's tough when you're in banking, it's tough when you're in a pharmaceutical in New Jersey competing with people going to other pharmaceuticals. How do we make ourselves different? And so I think those kinds of data all along the talent life cycle, new hires, experienced people, late career, high performers, those who have left, recruiters who are bringing people in, when you gather data from those different sources and pull it together, it really gives you a rich feeling about how we can differentiate our brand from those of competitors. Why would somebody want to come here? Why would they want to stay? And what can we do to enhance that? The other one that number 4 here on in the sum slide is around this class issues, and Mark talked about this with be careful what you average up, and that's true across units. When we first looked at Jack in the Box data, we found very little differences because it was at too high a level. But the same is true in thinking about individuals, and Mark talked about this, I think, with the manager level. How do we go in and help those managers? But also be careful about classes of people, because the popular press today, and I've just done a whole series of blog posts on this, it tends to classify groups like millennials, like women, and putting them into buckets as if they all think and act alike. And the reality is that they don't. And part of this millennial study we did for my new book coming out for late this summer really looked at that issue. And we were surprised at the huge variance in career objectives, in balance between work and non-work activities, between aspirations, between what motivates people. You have a range of high and low achievers. You have a range of people who are high risk takers and low risk takers. Not every millennial wants to go start a business and be part of the gig economy. It's just not, it's great press, but it's just not true. So, we'd recommend in your organizations to really understand that and understand those differences, because the risk, again, is for HR to come out and say, here's what this group is like. Let's just go do something uniformly to everybody, as opposed to looking at that great restaurant manager who knows how to bake the perfect talent cake. They're given a whole group of different talent, and, they got 25 to 30 people to manage, and some have elder care, and some are going to school, and some have child care, and they're at different stages of their life. Great managers find ways to put that together to create high alignment capabilities and engagement. Poor managers tend to apply rules uniformly. Nobody gets Fridays off, or whatever it happens to be, to say, well, we're fair to everyone, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't optimize those individuals. And I think Mark's issue about, I think he said most of it on buy-in, but I think that's one of the toughest parts here is there's a lot of organizations gathering data. We just did a program that Johnson & Johnson hosted here in New Jersey on analytics a couple weeks back. And that was one of the big debates among very senior execs here in HR, saying we're still struggling to get leader buy-in. And I think the path that Mark and Jack in the Box took was very productive in terms of starting to bring people data, starting to bring them on board, getting them to test hypotheses, beginning to see that decision A or decision B would be affected by what you bring back. And I think it's a great way to start, pulling executives into it so they have confidence that HR is bringing them something that really makes a difference to the business. And it's been true for IO psychologists, often working in HR groups as well, is how do we become more relevant? I think it's bringing us information that really helps make business decisions. So with that, Raymond, we're happy to take some questions.
I do have a question, Bill. Thanks. This is geared to Mark. You mentioned HRIS systems. Did you have a HRIS system in place, a good system to get the data that you needed to make these decisions, or did you have to make changes to your HRIS system as you evolved as a company?
Yeah, great question. We were fortunate, so much of the data that we track from a talent management perspective, whether it's performance management stuff or high potential stuff or all the kind of employee demographics, was pretty much at our fingertips. So we didn't have to do a lot of re-engineering work there. So we got off pretty easy on that one.
What would you recommend to someone who maybe isn't at that point? Do you try to figure out what you want to measure first, or do you need to get the system in place? It seems like could be a chicken and the egg question, but any advice from that standpoint if you don't have it at your fingertips?
Yeah, if it's not readily available, and of course a lot of it depends on the size of your organization, right? So you want to kind of as efficiently as possible gather that information. I mean, I suppose the worst case scenario is you could collect some of it through the survey. Now, the danger of that is people are going to start to be a little suspicious, first of all, about is this really anonymous, right? If you start to ask me a bunch of questions about me demographically, I might be a little weary of that. So I think it comes with price if you go down that path. So I think that would force you into what are the most critical types of things we want to ask questions about. So you'd have to have some insight into what's going on to say, like, hey, we think turnover's high with new hires in this area of our business. Okay, so how can we go after just that variable, in an efficient manner? Because otherwise you're talking about, especially if you're a large organization, you're talking about a fair amount of data.
Sure. That's great. And we're just a couple of minutes to the top of the hour. Doesn't look like any other questions came through. I want to first thank Bill and Mark for this fantastic presentation. I know I personally learned a lot. I hope everyone has as well. It looks like all the attendees stuck with us till the end, so that's fantastic. Just a reminder in summary that the presentation will be sent out in a PDF format along with the HRCI and the SHRM credits. There were several questions that came in, so you will get a copy with the materials that come out in the next couple of days. Also, please take the survey as well as give us some information on upcoming topics that you may be interested in. I think that's it for the day. It doesn't look like any other questions are coming through. So I know that you may have meetings that you're running off to. Mark, Bill, thanks again for your time. This has just been a really great learning experience for myself and everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And
thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. Thanks so much. And we'll talk to everyone and see everyone hopefully next month.
All right.
Thanks again. All right, guys. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.